week and another chapter of our story. We are resuming Children of the Nameless, and I'm honestly very thankful to be doing just a nice calm story reading after a very long day of editing videos. When we last left off, we were doing chapter 4 and 5, and now we are officially on part 2 of the novel of 3 parts. It's not actually a very long novel. You'd think the 188 pages would imply it's huge. It's really not bad. As you can see, we're almost a third of the way through, and we've only had 2 hours total dedicated to this story. So with all of that said and done, I can begin with Chapter 6, Davriel. Davriel felt he could hear the bog, despite the distance, as his carriage bumped down the overgrown forest road. He'd come to this plain specifically because so many others avoided it. This land had a chill to it, a sense of dread that ran deeper than the unyielding autumn and the watchful trees. It disturbed even the most callous to visit a place where human beings, with loves, lives, families, were often just food. It's a good reason to stay off of Innistrad. It's just a shithole, in my opinion. What other lands whispered, this one screamed. Feelings and aspirations were immaterial. In the grand scheme, your dreams were less important than your duty to reproduce, then become a meal. The carriage jostled as it hit one of the many ruts in the road. Miss Highwater cursed softly, then scratched a line through something she'd been writing in the ledger. The girl, Takenda, sat next to her, clutching her viol. Davriel had pretended to be reluctant in returning it. In truth, he had no idea what he'd do with such a thing. He preferred silence. The road crested a rise, and outside moonlight frosted the tops of the trees. A flock of birds, too distant to distinguish the species, broke up into the air as something startled them. They almost seemed to trail wakes through the moonlight, like fish in a current, as if the light were somehow too thick. It's out there, Davriel thought. That direction. The cursed bog. He claimed to be lord of the approaches, but the villagers only gave lip service to fealty, and even to religion. The sole thing that they really seemed to respect was that watery pit, and whatever lived deep within it. The entity stirred inside him. No words for me, Davriel thought. Usually it upsets you when I think of the bog. The entity didn't speak, not even offering its usual assurance that he would someday wield its power. Something was off about this night. The disappearing villagers, the bog's ward, that cold moonlight. So, Miss Highwater said, continuing her interrogation of the girl. Only the 3 of them rode in the carriage. He'd put Crunchnarr and Brerig in the coachman's seat outside. The first victims were your parents, 10 days ago. Your sister escaped and ran to the priory. Yes, the girl said. She was training to be a Cathar for the church. When she returned with soldiers and they found my parents, some thought they might have been subject to dust willow poisoning. That happens sometimes to the farmers, you know. But we couldn't think why the man would attack them, then poison someone. Then the merchants were taken 3 days later, on their way to the priory. Witnesses? Miss Highwater asked. A priest saw the attack from a distance, Takenda said. He spoke of seeing the man of the manor and terrible green spirits pulling the souls out of the merchants. After that, we started to stay close to the village, and the prioress promised to send to Thraben for instructions or aid. Others died, though, taken by apparitions, which we started to call the Whisperers. 2 days ago, my sister fell dead near the farms. Oddly, she didn't seem frightened as the others had been. Her face wasn't frozen in a grimace of fear, at least. Perhaps she was taken by surprise. Anyways, the worst of it happened earlier today. Workers in the fields came running to the village, saying that geists were flowing out of the forest surrounding Varlazen. Miriam, my neighbor, woke me, since I usually sleep until near duskfall. Everyone hid in their homes while I took my spot near the cistern and started singing. Outside, Davriel cut in, they leave you out by yourself as an offering all night? I'm no offering, the girl said, lifting her chin. My sister and I were born with the bog's blessing, stronger than anyone had ever known it before. My songs protected the village at night. Isn't that hard? Miss Highwater asked, singing all night. I don't have to go straight through the night, usually, the girl said. A song here and there, some humming in between, but today, she looked away. It didn't work. The Whisperers entered the village, ignoring my song. I didn't see whatever it was, but I heard them whispering. Davriel leaned forward, curious. Why didn't anyone flee? Why just hide in their homes? Why not run away? Run? The girl laughed an empty laugh. Where would we go? Starve out in the woods somewhere? Travel at night, trying to get to Thraben where they'd turn us away? Their merchants and priests might come to the approaches, but they wouldn't accept a village full of refugees. Still, the Priory, Davriel said. It's close. Some of the villagers went to the church in our village, those who worship the angel. When she heard of our plight, the prioress had sent priests to protect us with their prayers. But faith didn't help the ones who hid in the church, just like it didn't help my sister. It seemed Takenda didn't follow the angel herself, despite the symbol she wore wrapped around her wrist. Curious. From his first arrival in the approaches, he'd found it unusual how staunchly the people here resisted the church. The priests of the priory, misguided fools that they were, had a trinket that stilled the souls of any who died there. No geists, no rising corpses, no terrors. Nope. That should have been enough to earn them converts, but few of the villagers accepted the angel's blessed sleep. Instead, they left instructions for their bodies to be returned to the bog. That cursed thing had its vines wrapped around their hearts. I knew the priests who came to help, Takenda said. The younger one, Ashwin, did a sketch of my sister once. They barricaded themselves with the faithful inside the church. I looked in on them at the end, and found only corpses. Davriel sat back, thoughtful. In the manner, he'd postulated this was the work of some rogue necromancer. But an entire village, defended by multiple priests with protection wards and banishing talents. Maybe we should have left, Takenda said, looking out the window. Maybe we should have run, but you don't know how it is, safe up in your rich manor. You don't know what it's like to sleep each night with a fervent prayer and an axe set by the door, just in case. This is how we live. There is always a shadow in the forest, with eyes that burn too darkly and teeth that shine too brightly. We've lived here for generations, trusting in the bog's ward. This is our fate. Hunker in at night and pray for the clouds to pass us by. The carriage bumped again. Then the wheels clattered on wood as they crossed an old bridge. The carriage lanterns soon revealed a collection of squat homes. Though the buildings huddled in groups, the reinforced doors and thick window shutters made each one look solitary. Water time. he spotted the first body in the street, a woman lying on her back, arms frozen in a gesture of panic, trying to protect her head. The face was locked in a mask of terror. Crunchnar slowed the carriage. Davriel stepped out into the silent town full of hollow buildings, like broken eggshells. This place, he decided with a shiver, was worse than the forest, where you knew you were being watched. Here, well, there was a question. Crunchnar thumped down from the carriage, wearing his full battle gear. Brerig perched on top of the carriage like a gargoyle, his stunted wings fluttering behind him. Gutmorn and Yeledris rounded out his retinue, a brother and sister pair of lightly armored Nightreach demons who landed on a nearby rooftop, their enormous wings settling around them. They were far less human-looking than Crunchnar or Miss Highwater, with skeletal features and long, goat-like legs. If anyone had been alive in the village, they likely would have died of fright from the sudden arrival of his procession. Miss Highwater helped Takenda from the carriage, then pulled out Davriel's cloak and mask. She held these toward him expectantly. He normally wore them in public. Fewer people from off-plane knew the costume than they did his face, and Davriel Kane was, of course, a newer name he'd adopted. He threw on the cloak, which had an old shadow charm from his days living among the demons of Vex. When the edges fluttered down, they left faint smudges in the air, like the streaks made by a paintbrush. It was a tad dramatic, but few would ever accuse demons of understatement. He left the mask off for now as he knelt beside the body of the frightened woman. He felt at the skin of her face, which had gone cold and stiff, then slipped his hand under her back. The sun had set almost 3 hours ago, and the attack had occurred just before that, but there wasn't a hint of warmth. The body heat wouldn't have faded so quickly on its own, even in a chill environment such as this. That also ruled out something like dust willow poisoning. It might provoke a catatonic state, but wouldn't cause the body temperature to plunge so quickly. He nodded to himself, working the muscles of her face, then moving one of her arms down. Definitely not a mere immobilization ward, like I used on you earlier, he said as Takenda stepped up beside him. He looked deep into the fallen woman's eyes, then used a mirror to check for breath. No sign of life, but also very little pooling of the blood at the back. Unnatural chill, no sign of puncture wounds from being fed on. Blue light around the lips, as you noticed. Muscles are taut, but can be posed. So, Takenda asked. So, this has been a waste of a trip, Davriel said, standing up and accepting a washcloth from Miss Highwater for his hands. It is exactly as I surmised at the manor. Their souls have been evacuated, and the trauma induced their bodies into a form of paralytic suspension. But what can we do? Davriel handed the towel back to Miss Highwater, who tucked it away, then handed him his walking cane. It had, of course, a sword hidden inside. He turned around, inspecting an entire village full of mausoleums. That depends on who or what is behind this, he said, gesturing with his cane. Your average necromancer would want the bodies. That they were left here tells us this wasn't the work of some common corpsemonger. However, there are varieties of necromancers who build devices using souls as a form of power, and there are many creatures in this land who feed upon souls. Some attack aggressively. Others, like demons, engage in such feasting only as a delicacy, once the soul is won through contract. I doubt it was demons, Miss Highwater said, flipping back a few pages in her notebook. The girl said that many of the doors were still locked. She had to break in and check for survivors. She heard these whisperers, but couldn't distinguish the language they spoke. The whisperers could pass through walls, Takenda said, but someone was controlling them, right? Yes, Davriel said. Even if you hadn't heard footsteps earlier, we could surmise that. The subterfuge using my likeness, the precision strike to excise your sister, then the collected assault. Someone is controlling these geists. On their own, they wouldn't have the presence of mind to act in any coordinated way. He pointed with his cane. Take me to one of the locked buildings you opened. Crunchnar and Brerik joined them, the little demon holding a lantern for light, while Gutmorn and Yeledris took to the air, watching for danger. They all had various claims upon his soul, per the contracts he'd made with them. The terms of each were different, but each shared one important element. Their reward was predicated upon him surviving long enough for the deal to be fulfilled. If he died early, they got nothing. That was the first rule of demonology. Make certain the demon's incentive aligns with your own. Though the concept was simple economics, it was so easy to forget. They reached a nondescript home with a broken window. The shutters to this one had apparently been unlocked for some reason during the attack, so Takenda had been able to get in easily by breaking the glass. They went in through the door, and there found the bodies of a young family, with 2 small children, huddled in a variety of states of terrified panic. Davriel handed Miss Highwater his cane, then did a perfunctory check of the bodies, which had the same signs as the first woman. As he worked, Brerik heaved his stumpy body up onto a counter near the stove and began rummaging through the cupboards. He tossed out a few empty jars after sniffing them, then kept rummaging. "If it's here, Master," Brerik said, "I'll find it." "He's looking for tea," Davriel realized. "For me." The little demon had a habit of fixating on one thing Davriel said, then trying his hardest to fulfill it. He came out with a jar of what appeared to be dried-up garlic cloves, and obviously couldn't decide if it was tea or not. Miss Highwater gave him a covert shake of her head, so he tossed it aside. Davriel turned back to the investigation. "These were followers of the bog?" "Yes," Takenda said, her voice sounding hollow. She carefully tucked a blanket around the smallest of the children, a boy who couldn't be older than 4. His terrified face was frozen mid-scream, eyes opened wide, and he was clutching a straw toy for comfort. Davriel had been inclined to trust Takenda's description that these whisperers were a form of apparition, but she'd been blind, so it was best to check for himself. The bodies in this home, which had otherwise been locked tightly, seemed proof enough. Whatever had done this could pass through walls. Brerik limped over, carrying a pouch that looked promising. Indeed, it had once held tea, judging by the scent. "Sorry, Master," Brerik said, upending the pouch and proving nothing was inside. "It's all right," Davriel said, standing up and wiping his hands on the cloth Miss Highwater provided. "Riddle?" Brerik asked. "Go ahead." The little demon scrunched up his face. "Is it air?" "That's actually a good guess," Davriel said, "but no, it's not the answer." Brerik smiled, then tucked the pouch into his pocket as he exited. Crunchnar, who had waited outside during the investigation, thumbed over his shoulder, sending the smaller demon to go watch the horses, which he did without complaint. Honestly, Miss Highwater said, I don't think he I don't think he ever wants to figure out that riddle. Perhaps she was right. It was criminal how loyal Brerick could be. Davriel stepped back out onto the street, Takenda following. Well, she asked, what now? He pointed with his cane toward the shadow of the small church at the center of town. Crunchnard led them that direction with his lantern. How much do you know about the bog's ward upon you? Davriel asked Takenda. All of the approachers are marked. The bog's protection. It's said that because of it, we don't suffer nearly as many attacks as we should, living this far away from the rest of society. I don't know about that. When I was younger, attacks seemed frequent enough, until I learned to sing. She looked down. Before my failure today, I thought it would always be enough. My sight in exchange for the song. A curious curse, Davriel said. It's a reminder, Takenda said, of what I owe the bog, of the debt we all owe to the bog, for protection. She seemed to waver as she said it, looking toward an open doorway with bodies inside. Well, Davriel supposed he couldn't blame these people for a little superstition. There was something different about the approachers. That was the most intriguing part about all of this. I can't believe that I can't believe that the Bogdanovs are behind this too. You're absolutely right. Protection from what? Protection from things in general, true name. The bog's protection for the approachers in this village. It keeps vampires away, zombies, werewolves, all the horrible things that go bump in the night on Innistrad. It's a weird protection, but it worked up until now. Something is very odd about these spirits who invaded your town, Davriel said, gesturing with his cane. Miss Highwater, would any discerning demon make a deal with an approacher? She wrinkled her nose. Of course not. And why not? Because they're claimed already. Everyone knows that. You can smell it on them. Crunchgar grunted, then nodded. Like we can tell when a soul is already under contract to another demon. It takes a powerful prize to be worth entering such a bargain. Thank you for the compliment, Davriel said. Miss Verlazen, the mark upon your souls is less a protection and more a sign of ownership, a claim. Your song functions the same way. It scares off beasts and spirits because they recognize the danger in provoking the bog. Killing you would be like killing a powerful lord's hounds. But your song did not help earlier. Ergo... Takenda stopped in the street, her instrument strapped to her back. Though Miss Highwater had given her a handkerchief earlier to clean her face and hands, her peasant's dress was still ragged and bloodied from where she'd scraped her arms. She gaped at him. Surely, she said, you aren't implying the bog took them. I feel like Davriel would be the most useless planeswalker on Innistrad. Isn't his entire thing about making shitty deals? I feel that people of Innistrad would be smart enough not to... sort of. He specializes in dealing with demons. We'll get to that in the story. He doesn't make deals with everything. He doesn't deal with werewolves or people. He deals with demons. We'll get into more of that in just a second. It is my leading theory, Davriel said. There is another possibility. Perhaps these geists were sent by someone powerful enough to ignore the bog's claim. Still, I can't help wondering why your warding did not work. Perhaps the thing that took these souls was made of the same power. While a mouse might fear the cat's scent, the cat itself won't even notice it. The bog protects us, Takenda said. It demands our souls when we die, but otherwise it wards us and keeps us safe. It couldn't have been involved. Possibly, Davriel said. I've always found it difficult to separate your little cult from the bog's actual interventions. It's not a cult. This is just the way things are. Davriel glanced through an open doorway into another home, noting a body lying on the floor near the opening. He found himself increasingly annoyed, not by the deaths. Lives began and lives ended. There was no use fretting about every little loss. But these were his peasants. The bog, or something similar, had taken them in flagrant disregard for Davriel's authority. "We will become so much more," the entity said, ever lurking in the back of his mind. "There you are," Davriel thought. "Have you been napping?" "You continue in petty struggles for power and authority," the entity whispered. "You must realize these are meaningless wastes of your potential. Once you use my strength, infuse your spells with my power, you will outgrow all of this." That was precisely what Davriel feared. Ever since stealing the entity, pulling it from the mind of a dying man, he had been able to sense its vast potential. "Soon," the entity said, "we will escape this mundanity. Soon." They reached the church, a simple wooden structure with a peaked roof. No grand stained glass windows, not out here in the approaches. Just a wide, single-story structure filled with pews. Inside, the darkness was complete, as the few windows didn't allow in much light from the moon. The large front doors stood open, and the bar on the inside had been set aside. Curious, Davriel thought, resting his fingers on the engraved wood, noting distinctive scrapes. Those were fresh. Also of note, the door had once borne the symbol of the collar, the sign of the Church of Avacyn the Archangel. That had been sanded off some months ago. In addition, the identical stonework mark once sent into the arch had been covered over with plaster. "What's this?" he asked, pointing. "Why did your people remove the symbol?" "Well," Takenda said, "after that business last year, the prioress decided—" "Business last year?" Davriel said with a frown. "What business is this?" 1 second, sip of water. "With the angels?" Takenda said. He shook his head, then glanced at Miss Highwater, who seemed amused. Even Crunchnar raised an eyebrow. "You're not serious, are you?" Miss Highwater said. "The Archangel Avacyn went crazy, as did most of the flights." "What?" he said. "Really?" "The angels tried to kill us," Takenda said. "They wanted to exterminate humankind for our own good. Even here, away from the main body of the church, we heard about it." "Huh," Davriel said. "That sounds like a rather large hassle." "Oh, Dav," Miss Highwater said. "I gave you 3 briefings on the matter." "Was I listening?" "Obviously not." Takenda, incredulous, waved toward the sky. "The moon? Didn't you notice the moon?" "Oh? Did it try to kill you too?" "The symbol," Takenda said. "The enormous rune etched into its surface." He stepped back, looking up at it, then cocked his head. "Has that always been there?" Takenda looked at him, incredulous. How can he be so shrewd, yet so oblivious at the same time? "You ask a question that has tormented me for years, child," Crunchnar muttered. "Someday I will devour his secrets as he screams for mercy, his soul burning in my heart deep within hell. Then I will devour his soul. Hearth. And I shall endeavor to give you indigestion, Crunchnar," Davriel said, squinting at the moon. "You know, I like it. It has style. It's different." He held up his hand, making a fist in the air to summon Gutmorn and Yelendris. They flapped over, landing on the ground nearby with quiet thumps. The two claimed to be brother and sister, created upon the same day, though their faces were so twisted with horns. They also could have been siblings to a particularly aspiring fork, and Davriel wouldn't have known the difference. "Watch the perimeter of town," Davriel told them. "I don't trust this knight. The rest of you going to be all right if we step into a church?" "I do not fear the angels," Crunchnar snapped. "And I don't care," Miss Highwater said, "as long as there aren't any priests or banishing spells around." "Good enough." Davriel strode in. Chapter 7. Takenda. Takenda stopped in the doorway of the church as Davriel and the demons spread out to investigate. She immediately knew the sounds of this place, the way voices echoed in the eaves, the way of the small fountain trickled with the sound of spring water, on that symbol of purity just before Takenda's birth, an attempt to represent clean waters to contrast the impurity of the bog. Takenda had come here with Willia for services, though she'd never herself taken the oath of the Blessed Sleeve. The church cared about this true sign of devotion above all others, the promise to have one's body taken to the priory for burial, rather than accepting entombment in the bog. Takenda trailed to the front dais and the altar, which had holes for candles and twin poles at the sides. Once those had borne Avacyn's symbol, the general symbol of the church. Takenda remembered kneeling here as a child, one hand on each of the poles, feeling at the cold metal, the cast bronze symbols, while the priests prayed over her in an attempt to heal her from her affliction. The symbols of Avacyn had been removed at the prioress's command. Apparently, everyone in Thraben worshipped a new angel now. But could you really just change your faith? Swap it out like changing shirts? What made this new worship any better, and how long had the old one been flawed? Willia wasn't the only one here who had taken to wearing the symbol of the Nameless Angel instead, a mysterious figure who had granted the approaches the boon of the Sealand Stone, the relic of the Priory. Crunchnar poked around inside the building, his motions exaggerated, as if he was trying hard to prove just how unbothered he was to be inside a church. Miss Highwater stayed close to Davriel, who inspected the beam that used to bar the door. Then he turned his attention to the windows, which he opened in turn, looking at the frames. Innistrad needs Bill Nye. Every plane needs Bill Nye. Takenda walked to the bodies, which lay in shadow. Crunchnar's solitary lantern left the wide chamber feeling gloomy. Around a dozen people had fallen here, 2 families' worth. The faithful among the village, a handful compared to those who had stayed in their homes to instead trust the bog's warding song. With them were the bodies of the priests. There were 3. Old Gurden Vala was their village priestess, a woman Willia had always called stern. She'd fallen at the altar, holding aloft a symbol of Avacyn, a now forbidden icon. When danger had come, she'd turned back to her original faith. The other 2 priests had come from the priory to try to help the people in this emergency. Takenda didn't know them as well, though the younger one was Ashwin, the priest who had once done a sketch of Willia, his body huddled against the wall, eyes wide open. Takenda knelt and slipped a sketch pad from the ground beside him, and inside found sketches of people, priests, villagers, several of the prioress herself. The last sketch was a quick drawing of the church from this perspective near the wall, the pews in a line, the front doors wide open and the moon beyond. Standing in the doorway, drawn as quick unfinished outlines, were transparent figures with twisted faces, ghastly images that reminded her distinctly of what she'd seen earlier at Davriel's mansion, when the Cathar's spirit had twisted into a fearful geist. She shivered at the haunting sketch, rough, but somehow compelling. She could imagine the priest there, huddled in the corner, drawing furiously as the church's wards and prayers failed. She took the sketchpad to the front of the room, where Davriel and Miss Highwater were again inspecting the front door. "What's this?" Davriel said, stepping over and taking the sketchpad from her. "Too dark. Crunchnar, would you get out the lightning? Would you get on with lighting the lamps in here? I can barely see how ugly you are." Crunchnar grumbled, but started to do so. Davriel turned the sketchpad toward the light, then nodded. "Makes sense." "What makes sense?" Takenda said. "Miss Highwater," Davriel said, handing the sketchbook back to Takenda. "What would you make of this situation?" "The church's wards held for a short time at least," Miss Highwater said, pointing. "Scratches on the doors and windows, which looked distinctly like the marks made by geists trying to claw their way in. They wouldn't have needed to do so if they could simply pass through these walls, as they did with the other homes." "Excellent," Davriel said. "Miss Verlazen, this is compelling evidence." "Evidence?" Takenda said. "Of what?" "These whisperers could not enter the church, at least not at first. The powers of the priests were sufficient to hold them back." Takenda looked back at the pictures of the spirit at the doorway of the church. "You said before that it was possible the geists weren't affected by my song because they were too powerful. But if the church's ward held them back, I doubt something powerful enough to completely ignore the bog would in turn be stopped by the wards of these priests," Davriel said. "That said, we have proof that the Priory's authority can ward away the bog's influence. The claim it can make upon the souls of those buried there, for example. As the Whisperers were unaffected by your song, but were stopped by the priests, I find it increasingly likely that they are from the bog. In fact, the spirits you heard whispering were likely people from your own village." He strode across the room, cane clicking on the church's tile floor. Takenda hurried after him. "What?" she demanded. "What do you mean?" "The attacks started slowly," Davriel said. "At first, just 2 people, your parents, on a trip to the bog. Then a few more, rising in frequency, until the final attack on the village. Why so many days between the first attacks, then a growing, overwhelming attack at the end? I suspect it was because these whisperers are the very spirits we're searching for, the disembodied souls of your villagers. The spirits can perpetuate the theft. Once a few geists were made, they could send together others. The multiplicative effect would compound their numbers quite quickly, growing their ranks far for larger and more daring attacks." Takenda froze in place, horrified by the idea, but it made a twisted kind of sense. Her sister's face, it hadn't been frightened when she was taken. Could it be that she'd somehow recognized the geists coming for her? Could it have been her parents? "Miss Highwater," Davriel said, "several questions remain. Someone seemed to be helping the bog, as evidenced by the footsteps she heard. This leads us to the answer of how the church was breached. The wards were, after all, holding." "Vampires?" Miss Highwater guessed. "An excellent guess." "But wrong?" she asked. Davriel smiled. "Wait," Takenda said. "What is this about vampires?" "The door was opened from the inside," Miss Highwater said, pointing. "The bar was removed willingly, with no signs of a forced entry. Your sketch proves that the spirits entered through the doorway, so someone let them in. That's why I guessed vampires. A creature who could control the minds of someone inside and get them to open the doors. And would open doors allow spirits to enter a warded church? Davriel said. I'm not sure, Miss Highwater frowned. Beyond that, could an approacher even be mind-controlled? Davriel asked. Have you ever tried to reach into one of their brains? I'll tell you, it is not a pleasant experience. The bog's touch is quite powerful. So, Takenda asked, what happened then? Check the bodies of the priests, Davriel said, weaving toward the corpses. I just did that, Takenda said. Then do a better job this time, Miss Verlazen. She frowned, but walked over and knelt beside the corpse of the young priest. She looked him over, then, timid at first, turned his body. He's not really dead, she told herself. He's just sleeping. I'll save him, like I'll save Willia. His body didn't seem different from any of the others. She moved to the older priest from the priory, who lay on his front, with his head turned to the side. He had the same frozen, glassy expression as everyone else. Takenda rolled him to the side, and found a stab wound in his chest. She yelped, letting go, but Miss Highwater took the body and rolled it all the way over. He had been killed with a blade. How had Takenda not noticed that? There's barely any blood on the floor, she thought. It stained the front of his robes, but hadn't pooled underneath him. His body froze like the others, once his soul was taken, Miss Highwater said. Damn it, Dav, how did you know? The man of the manor walked past, looking self-satisfied as he began to rummage at the altar. What does it mean? Someone stabbed him, which interrupted his prayer, Miss Highwater said. Then, that someone opened the doors and let in the Whisperers. There was a traitor in the village. Yes, Davriel said. Do you know exactly who was in this room when they first barred those doors? No, Takenda said. It was a confusing time, and I was still blind. My eyesight didn't return until just after dusk. Might be worth having someone audit the town anyway, he said, so we can see if anyone is missing. A task we could perhaps assign the priests of the priory come morning. Unless... Miss Takenda, your sister is dead, so we can't interview her. But you said a priest was among those who identified me. Do you know which priest? Edwin, Takenda said. A younger man. He happened upon you, or someone dressed as you, I suppose, attacking some local merchants. That was the first time anyone reported seeing geists involved. She trailed off. Those were the first attacks after her parents had fallen, and Edwin had reported seeing 2 geists. It seemed obvious, now that Davriel had pointed it out. Those 2 had been her parents. The horror of it suddenly threatened to overwhelm her. She slumped down on the ground beside the stabbed priest, surrounded by corpses. Her parents, her sister, the people of the village, they'd been taken, corrupted, forced to come back and rip out the souls of those they loved. And Davriel said the bog was involved, that it wanted this for some reason. Takenda had been using a kind of focus to keep herself moving. First, a narrow focus on attacking the man, then a focus on trying to save her sister. But if she really stopped to think about how terrible it all was, she was the village's last protector, but in the end, she was barely an adolescent, and she had no idea what she was doing. What would she do if the bog itself was against her? If its gift was useless, what was she? She hugged herself and wished, for once, she had someone to sing to her, as she'd sung to Willia in the night. She wished she could hear that song of joy, the one that, moment by moment, she seemed to be forgetting. "The priest, child," Davriel said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "What do you know of him?" Not much," Takenda said, shaking herself. "He's Approacher-born, but trained in Thraben. Surely you don't think he was involved in this? They might have opened the church doors here for a priest," Davriel said. "It would explain a lot," Miss Highwater said. "Someone seems to have gotten through those doors, then stabbed the priest saying the prayers, letting the Geists flood in. I'm making no absolute judgments yet," Davriel said, still poking around behind the altar. "I have no concrete theories on why a priest would work with the Bog. I can't even say why the Bog would go about murdering its own worshippers, if indeed that happened." "Then, what do we do next?" Takenda asked, blinking, trying to recapture her focus. She couldn't think about it all too much, or it would overwhelm her. They weren't dead. Willia wasn't dead. Focus on that. "We need magic that can deal with Geists," Davriel said. "I'd best want a spell to track them. Sometimes, if you can isolate a Geist, then confront it with something very familiar to it when it was alive, a tool of its trade, perhaps, it will recover enough to answer a few questions. We might also want some magic to stabilize and anchor their forms, forcing them to remain corporeal so they can be resisted physically." "Do you have that kind of magic?" she asked. "No," Davriel said. "Technically, I have a few talents of my own. But I can but borrow from others, Miss Verlazen," Davriel said. "I am an unassuming beggar, a servant of all people." Crunchnar snorted as he lit another lamp. It still wasn't very bright in the room. "Many people," Davriel continued, "have some kind of minor talent. A magical knack, an aura of faith, or even some practiced wizardry. They're truly uninspired in the use of these blessings. I give them a little help." "He does that," Miss Highwater noted, "by reaching inside their brains and forcefully ripping out their magical abilities, which he then uses as he needs them." "That's horrible," Takenda said. Now, Davriel said. "It hurts me almost as much as it does them, especially if the magic I steal is from someone particularly self-righteous, and they recover the talents soon after my intervention. So what is the harm?" "Aha!" He stood up suddenly, holding something aloft. "What?" Takenda asked. "A clue?" "Better," he said, turning around the small jar. "The priestess was hoarding some dust willow tea." He unscrewed the lid, then his face fell. "Empty?" Takenda said. "You peasants have been exceptionally lazy these last few weeks," he said. Yes, being murdered by Geists and all that, but really..." A thump sounded outside, and a shadow darkened the front of the church. One of the two flying demons, Takenda couldn't tell them apart, ducked into the chamber, holding a spear and speaking with a gravelly voice. "Master, riders on horseback bearing lanterns have approached the town." "What?" Davriel said. "At this time of night?" "They shot at us when they saw us," the demon said, holding up a wicked crossbow quarrel. "Gutmorn got hit in the leg. He landed on top of a nearby home to recover, but the riders are coming straight this direction. They look like demon hunters." Davriel sighed a loud, deliberate sigh and shot Takenda a glare. "You can't possibly blame me for this," she said. "I'll blame whomever I want," he snapped. "Yelendris, go fetch Brerig in the wagon. See if he can get here before..." A crossbow bolt snapped against the wooden door next to Yelendris, and shouts rose in the near distance. "Or," Davriel said, perhaps just bar the door. And we will call that a night. Thank you, everybody, for joining me. And I absolutely enjoy watching Davriel work. I think he's a great character, and I'm very much looking forward to continuing this next week. Thanks again very much for joining me. Have a great night. Bye.